How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. Last week, my feed got taken over by Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, and all of the Journey to the West lore videos for people who didn't know who that was. All of that happened because of the release of a video game called Black Myth Wukong. Everything that I have seen of the gameplay looks pretty cool, but the one that really stood out to me was the opening cutscene. I haven't played the game yet myself, but I really liked this shot here, and I thought the scale of it would make for an awesome diorama. That's Wukong right there. I'm going to be painting him and making the foreground in a few minutes, but first, I'm going to create the backdrop on this sheet of styrene. I started by transferring the outlines of the Heavenly Kings onto my blank canvas. In retrospect, I wish I had planned ahead and made it a lot wider than it is, and you'll see why that is later on. After the pencil work, I broke out the airbrush and began establishing some of the values and blocking in all of the silhouettes of the figures. I then began adding lighter shades of blue and gray till I had some nice looking clouds and mountain shapes, and then finally I switched over to a brush to begin the more time consuming part of this painting. The goal here was to use similar but different shades of blue for the midtones and pale yellow for only the highest highlights. The trick for keeping that distant look is to only make very subtle adjustments to the values, keep everything light and low contrast. I'm a little rusty on my canvas painting, and it almost feels like cheating, but adding the last bit of depth and perspective using the airbrush was a quick way to make everything look better than it actually was. After the backdrop was done being painted, I switched over to the star of the show, Sun Wukong. This is a file that I purchased from T-Figure on Colts 3D. I'll put a link to that in the description. I primed Wukong Myth Black, and then I threw on some base colors of purple and red, which will help bring some life to the shadows. Wukong is going to have his back to us in the final diorama, so to match the lighting on the backdrop, the light will all be coming from the front right and the shadows will be on the back left. I began building up the sunset light, focusing in with a nice golden color and working my way up to a very warm white. This speed painting style was learned recently after watching NJM. After the highest highlights were on, I brought everything back down with an oil wash and then began painting in all the details and the edge highlights. I used metallic gold paint for the highlights on everything that was gold, but only painted on the side with the light. I'm happier with how his back turned out rather than the front, which is great because that's the only part of him that we'll be able to see in the final diorama. After Mr. Wukong was done, it was time to make the base, and while I do that, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. If you're not familiar with Sun Wukong, he's a character from the book Journey to the West, which came out during the 16th century in China. The Monkey King has been the inspiration for many things that you might have heard of, including Goku from Dragon Ball, King Louie, Tarzan, Planet of the Apes, Curious George, Zootopia, Mighty Joe Young, Planet of the Apes again, but with Mark Wahlberg, Jane Goodall, and many, many more. That was mostly a joke, the only one from that list that was actually inspired legitimately by Journey to the West, and the Monkey King was Goku from Dragon Ball. The rest were just monkey related. According to Wikipedia, Journey to the West is considered the most popular literary work in East Asia and has influenced many modern anime and manga and been retold many times in many different formats. And most recently, and the reason for its current spike in attention, is for the game Black Myth Wukong. After the base had been carved and textured and terrain pasted, I sprinkled on various sizes of rocks and sand, which I sealed in place with isopropyl alcohol and watered down white glue. I protected the sides of the foam with some Mod Podge and paint, and then when everything was fully dry, I took it outside to prime. I gave it a sideways highlight from the same direction of the sun with a yellow spray primer. After that, it was just a process of building up the light, the shadows, and the midtones in a way that looked natural. I used various washes applied from the airbrush to achieve the look I was going for. I decided not to add any trees, because I felt like it would break some of the illusion of the forced perspective. I then threw on the sides of the diorama, and the next step was to prepare the lighting. I used another gesso board the same size as the base, which I flipped over to be able to install the LEDs. The recessed area will help hide them and keep them out of sight. I cut up sections of the LED tape, along with the marked cut points, and began taping them down to the board using the peel-off adhesive. Once the correct area of the board was covered in LED tape, I warmed up my soldering iron and I put some flux on all of the leads. I then daisy-chained all the strips together with little bits of wire, running one to the next, and then I tested my circuit, and I was very happy to see that it was nice and bright. It's also dimmable, which makes a big difference for how it looks in the final shots. The next step was to diffuse the light so that none of the individual LEDs would be visible. I prepped a sheet of acrylic, and I took that outside and I gave it a coat of spray-on frosted glass effect. After that, I removed the landscape for a minute to install the backdrop, which I spaced out evenly using a ruler. The little white spot that's visible at the back here won't be visible from the viewing angle when this thing is done. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I really should have made the backdrop wider so that it would wrap around the entirety of the diorama to get rid of those seams, which distract from the distance effect. I did paint those sides blue to match the backdrop to help reduce the problem a little bit. Once the foreground and foreground were in place, I began assembling the rest of the diorama. The last step to work on, which I had not thought through to this point, was to create a facade for the diorama that will be visible when this thing goes on a shelf. I started by trimming a piece of styrene to the same size as the box, and to find the right place to cut the window, I turned the brightness up to 100%, and I marked the corners of the light leak. I'll also be making the viewing window slightly smaller to boost the illusion of distance. I didn't want to just have a flat surface here, and I remembered that I had a test print that I did on a printer of mine. It had this Chinese dragon pattern on it, and it was the perfect size, so I cut it from top to bottom on my bandsaw. These pillars were just the thing to help break up the large, flat, boring surface. After scoring and snapping out the window, I cut up and textured a strip of foam to look like rock, and I set that over top of the pillars, and then glued the pillars in place. Once the facade was done, I primed it black, and once that had dried, I gave it a coat of red sprayed at an angle from above. I painted the rest of the wall with a marbled red look, and my airbrush was giving me some trouble. I discovered that it had a large paint SCOBY in it. Once I removed that, everything worked better. I then glued the facade of the diorama into position, and the last thing to do was to glue Sun Wukong in place. And after that, I called it good. The monthly art challenge that my patrons voted on was Book Nooks. Before moving on to my final shots, please take a moment to enjoy this collection of work that they all submitted. Thank you to all the patrons who participated last month. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.